welcome to the Intuitively Wild podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Levine. Living intuitively wild is about coming back home to ourselves. Here, we talk about how to live connected to ourselves, others, and nature, and make a commitment to radical authenticity, vulnerability, and acceptance. On this podcast, we delve into a wide range of topics that span the human experience. We peel back the layers and talk about the things that are often not talked about. This is a space for us all to walk and wander this path of life together. Let's dig into our roots and go deep. Okay, today's episode is such a treat. When I first started my podcast and I was thinking of guests who I really hoped I could have on, this person was one of the very first people I thought of. Keith Partington is a yoga teacher and he manages the studio at Sonic Yoga in the city. And Sonic is where I did my first teacher training. And I share a bit about that story in this episode. But Keith, his practice, his energy, his philosophy around yoga laid the foundation for my philosophy and connection to yoga, and it has stayed that way ever since. To this day, he is the teacher who has had the most positive impact on me when it comes to yoga and the most lasting and grounding impact. And he's still the teacher that I am in contact with and whose class I take and his practice, when I finished my teacher training, I went to him and I said, I'm so sad to be leaving. I am so sad to not be able to take your class every day and learn from you every day. And he wrote out this practice for me to practice on my own sadhana. And I still use that as the foundation to my home practice, my sadhana practice every day. So, and that's a big deal for me. My yoga practice is everything to me. Keith has had such a huge impact on my life. And this conversation, I hope, shows you why. We go into the heart and soul of yoga and Keith's beliefs around it and his heart in it. And we go deep into that and the issues we have with the yoga world today and how we navigate that. But it's also a really fun and lighthearted episode. We laugh a lot. It's one of those episodes where I was like, I wish that I had video for this and people could watch it because I'm laughing the whole time, I'm smiling the whole time, and it just feels so good to be connecting with Keith. And I'm so grateful for his presence and impact in my life, and I hope that you all feel that energy throughout this conversation. If you are ever in New York City, you should definitely go to one of Keith's yoga classes. I do promise you that he might keep you in a 5-minute downward dog to begin with, and don't go in expecting the stereotypical asana class. Know that you are getting the real deal yoga, and it is the most important thing. And with that being said, let's get into this week's episode with Keith. Keith, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Rachel.
So the first question I love to start with is, what is something you wish people knew about you that you don't think many do?
Oh gosh, that's a tough one. I wish people knew that I meant well and I'm a lot softer than I probably come off, because I try to keep control of things because I think there's a lot of very good reasons to do that, namely to keep people safe and so that we have the experience that's intended, which is yoga, nothing to do with me, it's yoga. And so I think people sometimes that comes off in a way I don't intend. And yet I haven't found a better way.
It's so interesting that you say that because you do have this commanding, slightly intimidating presence, especially at first, before you get to know you. Then you realize that it is just kind of for me, I've more interpreted it as your integrity around the practice and just your heart for it. That's been my experience of your presence.
Well, I definitely appreciate that, but I think that I so appreciate that, but I think that a lot of people are not really necessarily open to the possibility that that could be the case. I think people come into the practice or what is presented as the practice with a lot of preconceptions and expectations. And I think that those are rarely aligned with what the practice is really about. And not that I'm the one to say what it's really about. What I'm referring to is going off of what the texts tell us. And that I think people often want to come into the room and do things really on their own terms. And I think that the culture of yoga in the West, namely the US and Canada, has been geared towards sort of a customer service exercise, and just like let's meet you on whatever terms you want it, and setting aside how impossible it would be for us to be able to know what their terms are,
Mm.
so yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, it's an interesting thing to try to offer some slice or sliver of yoga in the circumstances in which we're normally presenting it in. I'm
I
already rambling. Are you regretting this?
No, oh, no. This is exactly why I wanted to have you on. I completely agree with you, the way you teach and the way you practice, because I have been disillusioned and disappointed by yoga in many other spaces. And your teaching has remained true. I want to start with how you first found yoga and how your connection to it began and deepened, because I've always wondered if this is something that you felt about yoga from the start, or was it more of an unfolding?
I think it was a little bit of both. The reason I got into yoga was because I was really in quite a bad place in my life, and that manifested as a really terrible lower back condition. And I had such severe back pain that I really could hardly move. And this was for a while. This was months. I
Mm,
could stand up straight, or I could lie on my back on a hardwood floor. Anything
wow.
else, I'd be in tears. And I really mean that. I would be in tears if I was sitting down. I one time had to go to see a show with a girlfriend of mine at the time and her parents. And it was just absolutely electric, the pain that I was in. And this was like 3.5 hours. That's how bad it was. And so, anyway, I really did try everything, uh, all kinds of different doctors and various procedures and ways of looking at it and whatever. And all this time, people in my life, not yogis at all, just people in my life would say, "You should do yoga." And I was like, "What are you talking about, man? I can't even move." But the thing is that I know now certainly, but I knew even at the time that there was something in what they were saying. I knew that. I knew that there was a reason that they were saying it, and it was grounded in something that was relevant. And so eventually, just to cut a very long story short, I happened upon this great doctor, Dio, who, after a few sessions and listening to me for a while and letting it go for a while and coming back to it for a while, she just said, "I don't think there's anything wrong with anything. And I think that you should consider that. And I think you should check out this book." I mean, I'm not here to pump books at all, but she said, "I think you should check out this book." And it's by a guy named Dr. Sarno. And it's Healing Back Pain, the Mind Body Connection. He has several classics. And she said, "I think if you just read that book, you're going to feel better. I think actually, if you just start to read that book, you're going to feel better." And she was right. I read the book, and the basic premise of the book being that back pain had become like the new ulcer, as where it's where we have to store, if we're expressing what's going on with us, and there's not some outlet for our stress where in some way it's being resolved, even through the expression of it, just the simple expression of it for no other reason, it's going to go somewhere and it's going to sit in you. And I think that one of the most interesting things I found in that book is that it used to be very popular to have ulcers. Like, a lot of people had ulcers, and it became known, like, you're really super stressed out, and that's why, like, you got to figure out what's going on, or you got to try to find a way to have an outlet for that, because that's what that's essentially about. And as soon as people figured that out and it became accepted, there are not as many people suffering from ulcers, not nearly as there were decades past, and some, like, from the 20s to maybe the 60s or 70s. So it started going someplace else. There's a tremendous amount of people suffering from back pain. And when you think about the spinal structure and the eons of evolution of the human species, and how we've developed it to think of the spine as something that's so delicate that you could bend over and pick something up and slip a disc or whatever, and you're just wrecked. It's kind of absurd. We should be much more physically resilient than that, and we are. So anyway, that happened. And so I felt appreciably better. And this idea that had been planted in me about like, you should do yoga, you should do yoga. I agreed with the idea. I came to more and more agree with the idea, and that I really wanted to do it. But I was afraid to do it. I thought I can't even move and I'm in such pain, blah, blah, blah. So I decided, after having read this book and feeling a little better, but appreciably so, I decided I should join a gym that had yoga classes, but also had a pool. Because I thought if I start out by just like treading water, moving that way, that feels like it would be very safe and would be very helpful to me. So I did that, and I took my first yoga class. I'm getting to the point. I took my
You're
first yoga
fine.
class ever, and it was by a rather remarkable hatha yoga teacher. I still think she's a great teacher. I've never changed my opinion. The more I know, I haven't felt like, oh yeah, well that was a gym yoga class or something. She was a great teacher, and all she was doing was saying, she has us close our eyes, and she would just say, inhale and do this, and exhale and do that. That's it. Inhale, put your hand here. Exhale, step your foot back. Whatever it was, just the simplest, sparest instructions, but always with breath. So I was closing my eyes and I was breathing. And within the first 2 minutes of that yoga class, I knew I would be a yoga teacher. It completely just totally blew my mind open. And there was no Dharma talk. There was no conceptual instruction about like what yoga is or what we should be seeking. There was none of that. It was just like inhale, exhale, do this, do that. And she kept reminding us to focus on the breath. And she kept using subtle different cues to focus on the breath, but they were still very, very simple. I just knew that I had finally found my path. And I really did feel that way at that time. It was extremely, I mean, it was just earth shattering for me. And then fast forward, I took a lot of yoga classes at that health club, and I got really into it, and it did what I kind of thought it would do, in a really good way. It was just wonderful. And my life opened up a lot, and I became more open to other people and more social, and less of a recluse and less of a grouch. And I was kinder to myself. I was kinder to other people. And I just was kinder to other people because I felt like doing it, not because I thought I should do it. And I was kinder to myself. And that was much more important, actually. So then I decided that, yes, I do want to be a teacher, but I always kind of felt like, well, I don't know nearly enough. So the idea is absurd on the face of it. I have to practice for like years and years and years and years. I don't know enough yet. And then eventually I decided I'm never going to know enough. I'll never be done practicing. So I might as well just kind of get started on this. And I lived in the neighborhood of a studio called Sonic Yoga. I always would walk by it. So I was aware of it. And I just felt like it had a good vibe, and I was just curious about it, and it just felt right. And I just wanted to keep it simple because of the way that I had done everything else in my life up to that point was anything but simple, and it was super destructive and stupid and ridiculous. And so I just decided, let me just, go with it. And I got into the teacher training, and I was happy enough. It was fine. It was really nice. I was really enjoying it. And I think that also at the time I felt, like things were going in the right direction. And I was a little worried because I thought, I really have to be a teacher. Like I'm at the end of the road of everything else that I've ever tried. And like this has to work. So in a way, I felt like it wasn't serious enough. Like people were just kind of like, people were doing it for various reasons,
Mm.
and
Mm.
everyone seemed to be allowed, which is fine, of course. But I was like, I want this to be like more exacting and demanding and strict. And so they said at the time, they said this teacher is going to come later. He doesn't live here, so he's just going to come into the program a little bit later and do a couple sessions with you. And he's really out there, and it's really crazy, but he's really good. And I was kind of dreading it. I was like, oh God, because I guess at that point I was kind of settled in and comfortable. And I just kind of thought, I'm ready to make sure I know how to sequence a class, which is so stupid. I know you know what I mean. It's just so
I do.
endlessly dumb. But I just thought, at this point, this is what it seems that like it is to me. It's like learning how to sequence a class, and I'm getting chummy with the people who are in charge here. So that's all. I'm fine, and and we were also kind of coming to terms with what was presented to us and developing friendships in the teacher training. So we were talking with each other about it. We were thinking we got a handle on this. And so this teacher comes in, and we've been learning vinyasa yoga, whatever that is. If you know what that is, I would appreciate you telling me. So we were doing vinyasa yoga, and this guy was supposedly a hatha teacher. This guy comes in, and we're all waiting for him on our mats. And he walks in and he's like behind us because we're facing forward. He walks in from the back. That's the way that room was oriented. And he says, Uttanasana. And we were like, a lot of us, I'm sure, didn't wasn't even sure what that pose was, but some of us knew, and he said, Uttanasana. And so some people figured it out and they were like, yeah, I guess this crazy person's not going to say anything else. So let's just get into a forward fold. And then other people saw, oh, Uttanasana is a forward fold, of course. So everyone's in a forward fold for a moment. And it's the first pose, which seems absurd to us because we haven't sat down cross-legged and reached up with one arm and reached up with the other arm and all that
Mhm.
ridiculousness, and there was no lecture, there was no introduction, there was no hi, my name is so and so and I'm glad to be here. There was none of that, just first pose. And basically, I think the third thing he said, because he started directing breath. So that was the second thing he said. The third thing he said was, you guys don't know shit about yoga. And I was just like, oh, yes, this
He's
is what I
sounding like
want.
you.
Well, I mean, listen, he certainly came first. So if anything, I'm sounding like him. And there's no doubt he had an enormous influence on me. But the thing is that, so to me, that was like, I'm home and everything's feeling validated now because I didn't check out any other studios. I was just like, I have a feeling, I have a vibe, I'm going to Sonic. But that was feeling really validated because this guy came along and said, what you've been doing is ridiculous. And he certainly went on at length about that later on. He said, what you've been doing is ridiculous, has nothing to do with anything, nothing at all, nothing. Yoga is a state, it's not an activity. So are we in that state or not? Okay, we're not. So what are we doing to get into that state? And then what I loved about his teaching was that we were never going to talk about the experience we were going to have. We were just going to have the experience, you know, and to get into a difficult pose that seems jarring initially is just to me still such a great idea because it takes you out of thinking. It takes you out of like, this is what I expect and this is matching my expectations, or this is what I expect and this guy sucks, but it's still what I expect. It takes you out of all of that. You're just like in a pose. It's very physically taxing, which is such a principal tenet of what hatha yoga really is. And so you are right away in a fight, and of course you're in a fight with yourself, and you're right away getting into like what is my mind usually telling me about everything, really. But this is just a great way to like clarify and cut right into like, what is my mind usually saying to me, and is it even true? And the most basic example of it is to get into a pose that's really hard with no warm up for a really long time. And your mind is certainly going to say, this is stupid. There's no warm up. This is dangerous. This hurts. My wrists hurt. My neck hurts. My back hurts. I need a warm up. I need to do those spiral thingies first and all that stuff. And then if the teacher like makes you do it anyway, that's the thing. It's like if the teacher makes you do it anyway and you have to stay anyway, then you find out if these things that you're saying to yourself are true or not. You find out, actually, that's not true. I can stay here. I'm fine. I'm still fine. It's been 8 minutes at this point, and I'm still okay. And I think what it's doing is it's illustrating that there's this thing what we're seeking, or there's this thing that we say that we're seeking. And how is it are we seeking it? Often what we're doing actually is making very sure that we keep the parameters that we're comfortable with intact, and we just kind of like think about stuff. you know this approach is taking you into discovery because you're not where you want to be. You're not comfortable, and also you are not being told, which is so popular in yoga teaching. You're not being told, okay, we're going to do this, but if you don't like it, just stop and just get into child's pose.
Mm.
If it doesn't work for you, do something that does work for you. And so this, of course, is keeping us in the patterns that we're always in, because we're already doing things like that so often without even realizing it. And this, of course, is getting into like what I said earlier with your first question. People largely, I think, because they've been trained to think this way, it's being shown as the approach to yoga. People are like, why are you being mean to me, and why are you judging me? Like, if I want to come out of the pose, you're judging me. You
Mm-hmm.
don't know me, so why are you feeling like you have agency to even do that? And who are you? All of this stuff comes up. And the thing about being that way in the class, like, you have to, if you're not in charge, nobody's in charge. And if you're not like really, 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 really in charge in a way that is absolute, then none of this can work, because we're all still then just doing what we usually do. Only, well, now we're saying, like, well, I'm in a yoga class, and it's nice to be able to say that I took a yoga class today, and then nothing changes.
Mm-hmm.
Are you regretting this yet?
No.
I'm rambling.
Keith, I could listen to you talk all day, seriously. But I have a couple things I have to say. One is I was smiling so much when you were talking about your experience of finding sonic yoga and your experience with this teacher, because so my experience is I had my initial interactions with yoga, fell in love, knew I wanted to be a teacher. And when I decided to do teacher training, I purely went off my intuition finding a studio. I chose Sonic. I just felt like I knew nothing about it. I'd never been to the studio. I just felt pulled there. And I also had had that deep desire to go deeper. I wanted to know more. I wanted to, maybe it's a little elitist or the perfectionist in me or the whatever, but I wanted to be the best. I wanted to study with the best. I just wanted to do all the things. And so I found Sonic, and my most prominent memories of my first teacher training at Sonic was both with you. One was asana practice, and immediately you said downward dog. That's really all you said. And we were in downward dog for like 5 minutes. And I was like, this is amazing. The other is when we were doing pranayama. And when I had my teacher training at Sonic, there were, I think, 5 teachers, but most of our pranayama practice was with you. And I just remember the closing, and this goes back to what you were saying before, just closing my eyes and breathing, and the simple practice, yet very challenging practice of just being with our breath. It was transformative for me. And connecting the dots, I think something that was underlying all of your practices was this permission, this push to sit with this discomfort and not try to escape it, not try to understand it, not distract from it, just be with the discomfort and how challenging that can be. But when I tell you, that has transformed my whole life, so much of my life now, and how I have gotten to the place I am now is because I'm able to sit with discomfort. And it all started in that yoga class. So thank you.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. I would though deflect and say that's yoga. That
Yeah.
really, and it really is. I mean, and I know you agree with me. Anybody, oh man, I could just never shut up about this stuff. But one of the things that's wrong, I know all that's wrong somehow. One of the things that's wrong with the approach and the presentation of yoga in this part of the world is that teachers are too often, all too often, seeing it as kind of about them. And so it depends on how much experience they've had and how much they've taught, or who they studied with, and the poses that they can do, and all this stuff, and their way of framing things, and it's the way. It's not about that at all. I mean, you could have a brand new teacher, like brand new teacher, first
Mhm.
day, first 10 minutes of ever teaching any yoga to anybody. And they could take someone right into that experience if they themselves have some understanding of it and can speak to it. It's not the teacher, it's a state, it's an awareness that is available to everyone at all times and always has been from birth, but before that too, of course. This the thing is, like, the most effective techniques are certainly the simplest techniques.
Yeah. And that, I mean, one reason why I stopped teaching studio classes is because I mean, so many reasons, but it did feel like people were coming to, it was about performance. It was about aesthetic. It was about trying to be a certain way, or people perceiving me a certain way and wanting certain
Sure,
things.
certainly.
Yeah, wanting certain things from me that I wasn't comfortable giving to them. And so I'm curious how you counteract that, how you work through that, how you stay in integrity and stay confident in showing up how you want to in your classes.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, what I have, if I have done that, or what I have done is purely a matter of survival and also feeling like there are no alternatives. So there's nothing
Mm.
really that that pretty about any of it, or like I found this way of doing it and I can share it with you. Not at all. I think that first of all, if you love the practice, I think you should try to share it. And whatever the terms are, those are the terms.
Mhm.
So some way has to be found, and that's like the door most people are willing to walk through by far. I mean, 99.9% of people, if they're interested about yoga, they can accept the notion that there's a yoga studio, so that you go there and you take the yoga class, or they can accept the notion that there are yoga classes at their health club, and so they do that. And so I think that there's no point in denying that. I guess that's meeting people where they are, right?
Mm.
So, and you have to do that, and I hope people do that with me too, of course. But as far as like the rest of the stuff, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, if having people close their eyes in the practice is really powerful and important for so many different reasons. But something that you spoke to is tied up in it too. A lot of times, yoga teaching is so performative, and even if someone's not demoing, still the way they're swanning around the room and what they're wearing,
Mm.
all that is, we could just go into so many different areas of this. It's just so insane. There's the archetype of the male yoga teacher who's going to be kind of a jerk and have a beard. And then there's the archetype of a female yoga teacher who will be probably quite young and have an amazing body and show rather a lot of it. What's going on? It's very strange. But as I just said, the two archetypes, I slid right into the one that's available to me, didn't I? It's really, really weird. But the thing is that I tended early on. I can justify this and say it works, and for its really pure reasons, but I could also just say that I should be embarrassed by it because I'm kind of hiding. But I like to hover like in the back of the room. This is not about me. Like, you're not going to get any help by looking at me. There's just nothing there. This is you. This is about you, entirely about you. So even if you're not going to close your eyes, you're going to be staring ahead. But the problem is, if you don't have people close their eyes, they'll be staring ahead at the person in front of them, who is thinner and they want to be like that, who is heavier and so they're judging them, doing all the usual stuff, that we're always doing. So closing the eyes is extremely important to that. One of the things that I did notice with this teacher that I referred to that was so influential on me is that often he was hovering in the back of the room and telling us what to do, not showing it. That goes so entirely against what has also become sort of, I think, in a distorted way, so influential, and that's the Iyengar, in where everything has to be set up in this highly technical, geometrical, almost mathematical way. And probably the answer that's right is going to include props. And so those have to be discussed, and you have to show things. You might have to make minor adjustments. Let's change the tension on the strap, or let's change the height of the block, or whatever. And let's go on and on about it. So and first of all, I don't think that's what Angar was teaching at all. That's just my opinion.
Mm.
But it's been taken to such a crazy degree. If you say to people, sit down, fold one leg underneath you and cross the other leg over you, on your exhale, turn toward the inner thigh of the leg that's the higher leg, and you're in a seated spinal twist. It could be the shittiest seated spinal twist, but who cares? It's yours.
Mm.
It's yours. And now what do we want to do? Well, we want to find that you feel some sense of grounding through both sides of your butt. And then also we want to find that there's a support with the core muscles so that you can lengthen your spine, because this whole thing is about your spine. Every pose is about your spine. So let's find length in the spine, and let's now get the breath going in this position where you're folded in on yourself. And what will we learn from that? So much. And also this setup means you have leverage. To do what? To be in a seated spinal twist so you can say, I'm in a seated spinal twist, or let's take a picture of me and go, wow, look, I'm in a seated spinal twist. No, you're wringing out your digestive organs principally. Secondarily, you're manipulating the spine in this amazingly healthy way. Third, there's also these amazing diagonal stretches across the front and back of the body. So there's no more direct way to get at any of that than to feel it, and there's just it all gets so weird because like there's that thought which you can accept or disregard, but I always also found it kind of funny how there's this wacky culture in yoga studios that you've spoken to, and I think everybody knows about it already too, but how they feel about it, I don't know, but they know about it. There's this culture and all the things that go along with it. You have to go and you have to act like this, or seems to be what's required or expected. And if you don't meet those expectations, if anything, it gets weirder, or you feel so disillusioned, you leave teaching. Then once in a while, you'll happen upon some person who will come from some really small town and they had no access to a yoga studio, but somehow they heard about yoga or stumbled upon the concept of yoga. So they read books and looked at pictures and started doing yoga on their own. And they had such a powerful need to do the yoga on their own that they were so driven that they just somehow made it happen. And if you see their practice, sometimes you might certainly see some alignment things that are like, whoa, but still, it's powerful. And the point that I'm getting to is that other people, all these asshats who buy into the yoga studio culture, will look at that person and almost have like reverence for them. Like, wow, you're like real deal, or you like really fought through these far less than ideal circumstances and you started practicing yoga anyway. Wow, Well, why aren't we all allowed to make these discoveries with our eyes closed and using our intuition? Because what we do, here I go. So what we do, right, is we say we're yogis, or we say we aspire to be yogis, and we say that we're practicing yoga. And what we want to do with it is entirely rely on our intellect. And what we're meant to be doing, and all the texts back this up, this is not something I'm saying, this is what it is. What we're doing is meant to be getting into deeper and deeper touch with our intuition, relying on it and trusting it wholly, and seeing the intellect for what it is, which is a tool for the intuition. It is a tool for the intuition.
Mm.
But we get outside of all that. Look at the teacher. Do you see how they're doing triangle pose? Are you sure you see? Are you seeing that? Are you seeing that? And then now do your triangle pose. And well, let's see, there's a little bit of this here in your knee or your hip. So we better grab a block. Let's not find any other solution. Why would we do that? Let's get a block. How long have the blocks been around? They haven't been around that long, really, but we're lost without them in a lot of ways. But also the way things are taught with blocks is so, it's not even perfunctory. It's just like, well, this is what you do, so I better do it too. And I think as a teacher, it makes me feel safe if I can say, you probably want a block, so here it is, and have at it, and like nothing is being, and like, so people are thinking, only relying on intellect, but also thinking the way that they always think. So nothing is changing through this situation where they have decided to practice yoga. Like nothing's changing.
One reason why for the past few years, whenever I'm able to be in New York, and hopefully it'll be more often now that I'm living in New York, but not in the city. Whenever I'm able to go to your class, I mean, your class has been the only in-person yoga class that I have taken since before the pandemic, I think. And I mean, there's so many reasons for that. And some of them being there's no mirrors at Sonic, and
Hmm.
you don't practice while you teach, and that's not why I go. It's the fact of what that forces me to do, which is be in my body. And it takes away the performing from the yoga. It takes away the perfecting, and it just really brings me into my body. And it reminds me that yoga is an intuitive practice. It allows me to get into that state of mind that I'm able to get into when I'm practicing at home in my home practice, which is that awareness and that presence. And it's really hard to find that in a studio group class. I'm curious what your home practice looks like, what your personal practice looks like, and how that has changed for you throughout the years.
It's changed a lot throughout the years. That's always a good question. To me, that's always the question, and it's
Mhm.
interesting to banter that about with that between a couple of people because you really learn a lot from that, I think. So I certainly welcome the question, but I'm embarrassed to say that it's just gone to shit because I have a kid now.
You're a dad
And he
now.
yeah, and he's 11 months old, and so that has like really put everything into like that's quite a tailspin in terms of like what I do for myself, which is an interesting thing. But that's also like everything is the practice, right? Like everything, like whatever your circumstances are and however you respond to them, that's your practice. So I would say of myself, and I would say of anyone else, and of anyone else, doing sadhana, doing your daily practice that's for beginners. Like doing sadhana, which is like confined between 6:30 a.m. and 8 a.m. And you do these sets of formal practices and then you're done doing your sadhana. That's beginner approach. It's a necessary approach, of course, and it's extremely important. Please don't misunderstand me. It's extremely important. But are meant to do, of course, your sadhana all day long in everything you do. We don't live to do yoga. We do yoga to live. I still do things and I sneak them in. It's very important to do a headstand. I think that if you're going to pick one pose, and I love the idea of picking fewer poses, whether it's like, I have a 90-minute class to teach, I'm interested in how few poses can you do in that 90-minute class, not how many. Like, I think it's
Mhm.
much more interesting to see how few you can do. So I think if you're going to choose only one pose, that pose is headstand. You first have to be able to do a headstand, but all the things that will lead up to you having the ability to do a sustainable headstand that's safe, the entry and the exit and time in it are all safe. That means you've developed quite a yoga practice, as you know. So I think headstand really, if you're going to choose one, that's the one. And I think that pranayama is much, 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 much more important than asana. However, you have to do a lot of asana to be able to do pranayama because you have to be able to sit tall. You have to have your hips at an open angle for the reasons of energy moving through your system, but especially in the pelvic bowl region. You have to have that. So you have to do asana. It's always going to come back to doing asana because that's how you can do the other things that are important, meditation, pranayama. So I'm sneaking in headstands when I can, and I'm sneaking in pranayamas when I can. I sneak in down dogs and various like broad swath stretches when I can because it's been, not to make this about fatherhood at all, but it's been wildly more difficult than I expected it would be. And I thought it would be very difficult. And we're also in a one-bedroom apartment in New York City. So an especially tiny one-bedroom apartment for any non-New Yorkers who are listening to this. So that's kind of current, but I think that's all starting to settle down, and I'm starting to see ways that I could make it more formalized again and do a formal practice in addition to hopefully viewing my entire life as my sadhana, of course. So I'll try to be brief. In the beginning, when I hooked up with my hatha yoga teacher, who's a madman, certainly, and in some ways, not such a good way, also,
Mhm.
certainly a madman. The whole thing, which I greatly appreciate, was like, is it in a text? Has anyone ever said this bullshit that's being said so often these days? Let's make sure we can like walk it back and find the foundations. The Upanishads, the Vedas, the principal texts that underpin Ashtanga practice, the principal text that would underpin Hatha Yoga practice. Like, is any of this crap we're saying over and over to each other today? Can we find the roots of it? So we had to study the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, and it has 4 sections, and the section on asana gives you 11 principal postures that are considered to be the most important, except there's also 6 more which are also super important. you know and so the thing was like, at that time, this is like 13, 14 years ago, it kind of felt to me and to my classmates in that training, that hatha yoga training that I did after my sonic training, it kind of felt to me like, well, can you even do these poses? And if you can't, what's the matter with you? Come on. And these are really wickedly difficult poses. They're all pretty much seated poses, and they're wickedly difficult poses. And the point is that sadhana for a while, for me, for a long while, was trying to figure out how to do things that I thought I was supposed to be doing. I thought I had to know how to do them. That was a struggle, to say the least. And then there was like, well, you could also just not do that, and you could do like so many sun salutations, you're almost going to throw up. You could do that instead. And I really liked that approach a lot. And then that approach led me to having a much greater ability to be able to do all these wacky seated poses. So that was interesting. It was like our teacher, it kind of let us off the hook. We were all struggling for like 2 years to do these insane things in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which is a text from the medieval period. And there's a lot of wacky stuff in that book. You're supposed to go to the river and pull your entrails out and wash them in the river and then shove them back in. So we're all wondering, how serious are we really taking this? Because we all wanted to take it all very, very seriously. So
Hmm.
we all struggled with that, and we all had a different struggle, I'm sure, but the struggle was so intense. And then, like a couple of years into it, the teacher was shrugging and was like, "That doesn't matter. None of that stuff matters. Do sun salutation. Do them until you fall over. Do that as your sadhana." So that definitely opened up my idea of what sadhana was and could be and what should be. And then this is also still a struggle. What I try to do most is help people with that. And the thing is that there's just so many ways you can look at it, and it has to do with this fight that you're in. So for some people, it will work really well to say, here are some really, really tricky poses, learn how to do them. Sometimes for the people that will work really well for, that's just because they're achiever types. And sometimes they're very blessed with certain attributes that are very conducive to getting into those poses. I mean, those poses are designed for people who grew up and never were not sitting cross-legged on the floor always. So that's a very different circumstance from people who grew up sitting in a chair as soon as possible. Sometimes the things that people have the affinity for, that's the thing they need to get away from. They need to stop doing all these crazy poses and sit still. That's would be a much more powerful and also a much more demanding and difficult sadhana. So I went through then a great phase of sun salutations, and then I revisited some of the poses that I thought were impossible, and then they did become possible. So that meant I looped back some of those poses into the sadhana. And then I certainly had plenty of struggles where it's like you're over ambitious with your sadhana because you think you should be doing these things. So then what's happening is that, like, it might take an hour and a half. And so then one day you don't have an
Hmm.
hour and a half, obviously, like that's going to happen. And then your sadhana is interrupted. And so is it better to do a very ambitious sadhana and try to stick to it? Is it better to be realistic and say, listen, I always have 15 minutes, no excuses. I always have 15 minutes. So let's do something that you can fit within 15 minutes, and let's always do it. Like that to me is a much more effective approach. This goes back to also how few poses can you do to make up a practice. Do you need to do 6 pranayamas, or you can do 1 pranayama? Which is better? It's better to do one. If you know it, it's better to do one. So I'm very interested for myself, but also for others. Like, let's be real. Let's recognize that we're householders, and let's do very potent practices, and not that many of them. Because if they're potent, why do we want to keep doing, like, why are we piling the stuff onto itself? Like, you could say that, like, where you want to be is at the top of a table. That's where you want to be. That's the state of yoga, right? So you could get up to the top of the table through one leg, or through this other leg, or through the third leg, or for the fourth leg. But if you get to the top of the table, why would you do anything other than just remain at the top of the table? Why would you get up one leg and then climb down and go up the other leg, only to find yourself in the same place that is where you wanted to be in the first place? So simplicity in the practice, or a self practice, a home practice, I think is far more conducive to getting what we're after, is what we say we're after, which is yoga, which is a state. It's not an activity, it's a state. No one's watching, except everyone's watching, or you're trying to get as many people to watch as possible because you're putting every little thing you do on Instagram. You could argue that people are watching, and you're trying to get more and more and more and more people to watch. And that's a whole other conversation aside from the studio conversation, which is what has happened to yoga. And who cares? Like, nothing's happening to yoga. First of all, yoga's fine. Nothing's happening to yoga.
Hmm.
But what's happening is that we have this new, like, in the 70s, and in the 70s, I'm so old. In the 70s, we had like magazines. You'll have probably heard of these, Rachel. So there were magazines, and there were images in the magazines, and they were overwhelmingly female. and they were overwhelmingly thin and young, and it had started way back then, and then we got into, but still back then there were a lot of people who fancied themselves as being hippies, so they were reading texts and trying to do older esoteric practices. But then the 80s 90s came along and the practice became very physical and sort of very show off kind of thing, and we've never really turned the corner away from that. It became just different ways of doing it as kind of a one-upmanship thing. But the studio culture encourages this because you get into a studio, it's by definition a social situation. And so we are feeling judged, we are judging, we are therefore competing or feeling like we can't compete. And so we're feeling like crap about ourselves. Something's happening and it's not good.
Mm.
So the studio culture kind of supercharges the things that we probably shouldn't be concerned about at all if we're seeking yoga. And then social media, of course, has added rocket fuel to that.
One point that you made that I really want to highlight is yoga is a serious practice in the sense that we want to honor it and practice the truth of it, the heart of it, but we can't take ourselves so seriously. It's about being serious, but not taking ourselves so seriously. And I think that
Well said.
that's something that can kind of go astray with social media and the studio world. And then another thing I want to loop back to is how, when you were talking, it just made me realize how interconnected yoga and intuition are, and how my intuition brings me back to my yoga practice time and time again. And my yoga practice brings me back to my intuition time and time again. They strengthen each other and they support each other in the fact that they bring me back to presence and awareness and a sense of groundedness. And I would just love to know how you think about intuition and how you feel your relationship with your intuition is.
Well, I think it's everything. The end of the podcast. It's everything.
I agree.
It's just simply everything. And so
Mhm.
the relationship with it is really a struggle, and it's a battle because we have relationships with other people who don't necessarily see it the same way. So if we're trying to really follow it, it can lead to a lot of like
Mhm.
because someone else is saying, well, wait, but what about this, and what about this, and have you thought of this, and what about this? And it certainly, for valid reasons, that line of thinking and that approach, which is again all about the intellect rather than intuition, is very fear based. And so it becomes more difficult to follow your intuition, but also becomes like this kind of fight to justify the sense of following your intuition. It's a difficult thing to do. I mean, this is also the thing about yoga. It's easy to do yoga when you're alone and when you're in nature.
Mhm.
Easy. But to do yoga when you live in a city and you have maybe some kind of responsibilities that you have to hold to, and you have family members that you care about and feel responsible for, and people in your life that you care about and you feel responsible for, it's all going to be, or it can feel like it's at war with what you're attempting to follow. It can feel, I think, selfish. I don't even know why I'm taking in this direction exactly, but these are just the thoughts that come up, like intuition, because I would say, again, it's everything. What I've always tried to follow. And I think in a way, I was always doing exactly that. But I was also at the same time terrified and doubting myself and hedging and staying still, even though I knew what I was following and I knew where it was. I think I knew what was being said, but I wasn't able to act on it.
Yes.
That's the thing. Intuition. Intuition, it's formless, but action is not. Action is such a huge part of this equation, isn't it?
I do think that that's a place where people get stuck. They hear the intuitive knowing or they feel it, but they have fear or conditioning or beliefs that stop them from acting on it and trusting it. I actually think that yoga is another tool that has helped me push past that, because it comes back to sitting with the discomfort and using yoga to be in the life that we are in. Like when you were saying it's easy to do yoga when we're in nature or when we're on a retreat, but it's a whole other thing to do it out in the real world. And by embodying the practice of yoga and embodying what yoga has taught me in my real life, day to day, moment to moment, that gives me the capacity and courage to act on my intuitive knowings. I don't think that many people think of yoga in that way. And I think it's such a disservice to just limit it to the asana practice.
It's a remarkable problem. I about this very problem all the time because I sometimes I think I just want to stop teaching yoga and I'd be super relieved if I never taught yoga again. And I really do think that. It's just like,
Mm-hmm.
it's
Mm-hmm.
like I think that, like, if first of all, if all that we've been saying is true, it doesn't even matter. It certainly doesn't matter whether or not I'm teaching it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. Yoga's not going anywhere. Yoga is not something that we can even put our hands around in any way whatsoever. So who cares? And if I walked away from it, I tend to think that I would probably be very happy in my practice. I think I would practice alone a lot more. I think I would steal even more moments to just do any kind of yoga practices, you name it. And that there may be something in that, and I maybe should continue to listen to that thought, but it does tend to kind of strike me as a little bit of a negative thought because I think if you, as I said, and I think in the very beginning, like if you are into this, you should be trying to share it. I guess that part of me does think that you should find some way. I don't know how we get out or around this because I do think you have to meet people where they are. You have to, because I think that there was a time, I think it was kind of during the pandemic when I was trying in a very stilted way to get some more kind of real things across through whoever might be looking at my social media stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the people who are already like in agreement thought it was cool and read it, but other people, if they did read it, they were what the fuck, man. I mean, it just feels like a little bit intense or a little bit sort of like, dude, man, I just want to do yoga poses. It feels good, and feeling good is good, and of course it is so good. And I have this feeling that I want to try to find another way to present this practice that gets across to people because I don't think, like it just feels sort of like pushing the same boulder up a mountain to try to get this practice across when you are offering group classes which are asana based pretty much exclusively, and people are coming in with their expectations which have been set by those who have co-opted the practice. Really, like the practice started out a certain way in terms of how it was being presented in the West. Great. That was actually a very powerful moment, and it had reverberations through decades. But as soon as people started understanding that it was popular, it was co-opted by powerful commercial forces that are very persuasive. It's their entire aim is to be persuasive. And so people buy into that to a very large degree. And I think in some ways they don't even realize the extent that they're buying into it. And you're up against that, and you're trying to still put your arm around them and say, let's do this, and I will meet you where you are, and I'll try to take you a little bit further toward in this direction, which you can then accept or reject, and that's fine, of course. But it always feels like you're sort of like starting at the same place and getting this far. I don't know what the other way is, but it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and I probably should spend more time deciding I'm not going to think about it at all, and I'm just going to meditate, but really meditate. And what does that mean? That's a whole other podcast. But like there's attempting to meditate is not meditating.
Mm-hmm.
Meditation is a state. But yeah, so I should probably stop thinking about it. Maybe you can help me with that.
Well, I do think that you have the power, you could have a really big impact on shifting things. Like when you were saying that you were sharing your writings and the people who agreed, and the people who didn't, it didn't change anything. I think it could. I think that there could be so many ways that the way that you view yoga and the practice and all its different forms could change the yoga world. So I don't have the answer either, but I don't know. I think experimenting and trying it out and following your intuition on all of the ideas could be really interesting.
There are no ideas.
Well, I
There are no ideas. That's the that's the part I didn't make clear.
I don't know. I think if you gave yourself the space, I mean, I do this with
That's it right
everyone
there.
who I have on the podcast, I have their human design chart up too, and looking at yours. I think if you gave yourself the space, through meditation and the stillness, I think the ideas might come. And if you just threw things at the wall, something might come
Well,
from
that's what resonates with me about what you're saying. Because yes, of course, you're correct. Meditation, of course, no need to say anything else. But what I think of when you
that.
say create the space, and I think you'll feel this too,
Mhm,
is that like if we're occupied with a certain thing, it's really occupying us. And I
mhm,
think that we don't necessarily see, even though we are aware of the idea and we're trying to see, we don't necessarily see how much that's sapping from us and how much it's taking from us what we could be doing. And nature abhors a vacuum and everything else. And I often think, I'm just going to say it. I don't care. I'm just going to say it.
say it.
I often think that I should just stop doing what I'm doing, which is a terrifying thing to me, actually.
Mm,
I love so many people that I see all the time. I just love them. I think they're great. I feel, in a sense, I shouldn't. I really shouldn't. But I feel kind of responsible to them. I feel like I should be there for them. And I
mm,
feel like I was like, this at its root is not what I want it to be at all. It's not what I want to be a part of. At the root, then I should just leave, because if I left and if I stopped, just totally stopped doing what I've been doing, I would end up doing something else. I would end up, it would happen, I feel like. And that's a very scary thing, but it also makes me feel kind of sad for the reasons I just stated. It's just a weird thing, because sometimes I also think, well, and this is what I've been trying to do, try to, work within the system, do it that way, be in the system. I don't know, maybe that's not the answer, because the system, first of all, I mean, I don't know if even just to make a business case for it, I'm not sure how sustainable it is, like having a yoga studio when there's companies like Equinox and Lifetime and such offering what people think they want in a way that they are very happy to digest, plus all kinds of other amenities and luxuries and stuff like that. I don't even know how sustainable the whole thing is. And that's also the commercial viability of it. And if virtual is enough, sometimes I think virtual is the most magical thing that's ever happened. I mean, this is a great example of it. This right here, this is superb. You could be literally anywhere. It could be any time where you are. It could be any time where I am. And I
mhm.
think I think an exchange is happening, which is by far the most important thing in terms of like learning about this stuff. The exchange is how we're doing that. Sometimes when teachers start to whine about, well, the classes are all asana based, and I'm bummed out about that because of what it says about this or that or blah blah blah. But if you try to put, meditation classes on the schedule, no one goes to them.
Mhm.
No one goes to them.
Mm.
If you put pranayama session for a half hour followed by meditation on the schedule, you're gonna get 3 people to go to that, and you're gonna get 35 to go to the asana class.
Yeah.
There's what you want to do, and that speaks to, let's try to somehow work within the system. But also, if it's not wholly yours, if it's not yours, then I think it's also kind of very difficult to do, because I know that in the circumstances that I've been in, it's not just the studio that I'm most associated with at all, just anything. I've been involved with other things too. There's always like, well, I can't say that because it's not it's not mine.
Mm.
And I think can't say that. I think it's disrespectful. I think if someone's holding space, that I have to respect that, because if I could figure out at this point how to hold the space, I would have already done that. So, like I always want to show respect to people who are helping me at least have some approximation of really doing and sharing what I want to do and share. It's a pickle, man.
It is a pickle. But I think that well, I think it's true you can't force clarity, and that's been a very recent lesson that I've had to embrace because I am someone who always wants to figure things out and have the clarity and know the things, and it's this need for control for the most part.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you can't sit in meditation and be like, I want the answer to come to this problem. You really have
Right.
to go in just open-minded. But I do think that there's something to facing the fear that comes with what is coming from within you. And, when you say that there's one part of you that wants to leave completely, but that's very scary. I don't know. I feel like on the other side of that fear and the space that would come, and this is not me giving you any advice or telling you leave, because I, for one, would be absolutely devastated if I couldn't take your class again. So, no, but I'm also not, I also don't want to let that influence any decisions you make in the future, because I also would be excited for you. But I don't know. I think that facing our fear is, I there's never been a time when I haven't faced my biggest fears and something magical has come on the other side of that.
Hmm. For sure, for
But
sure,
I
for
also don't
sure.
think it has to be all or nothing. I think that there can be a way that we face our fears while also staying in what feels comfortable or what feels good besides that.
The thing about it also is that the way that I view some things that I feel like are limiting, that's just a story that I'm telling myself. It's not
Mm,
necessarily true
mm,
at all.
mhm,
I mean, I've looked at other teachers around me who seem to see everything with it in a very clear-eyed way, and they just take what they need to take from it, and they do all kinds of other things, and they don't care how anybody thinks about it or how it looks or whatever, and they're just doing fine. I do sometimes wish I had a lot more of that because I'll think of saying something on social media like, and who cares? Almost no one's reading that. Of course,
mm,
I know that almost no one's reading it. But the thing about like my social media is more so that like I never got into let me just try to get a lot of followers. Let me do whatever it would take to do that. Most of the people who follow me, if I ran into them on the street, I know who they are. I would have a conversation with them.
mhm,
So even though it's not a lot of people, those people mean a lot to me. So if they read something that I wrote, that would mean a lot to me, and I would hope that they would read it. But even that, I'm just speaking as like Keith Partington or Keith Partington Yoga or whatever. I still feel like I'm very so associated with this place and this thing. And so if I said something that was seemed really inflammatory, I would feel like, which is what I would do. I feel like that would really be the powers that be at that studio would be like, "What are you doing, man? Are you crazy?
mm,
Like, what? Like, maybe you don't want to even be here if that's how you feel."
mm,
So it's kind of complicated in that way because it's not that I feel that anything bad's going on that I'm involved in. Not at all. It's just more that if you're trying to run a business, which I would like to do myself, if you're hanging a sign on the door basically saying abandon all hope ye who enter here, like how is that going to work? Or if you say to people who are like, wow, this is a lot right now, and you say to that person, well then that's okay, it's not for you,
mm,
bye.
mhm,
Is that any way to do anything? I'm just speaking in very very broad strokes. It's just more a matter of like, can we somehow have a thing, can we have a thing that's not for everybody?
mhm.
Because like everything is always like, well, this has to be for everybody because we want it to work. We want a lot of people to be into it.
Yeah, I think it's impossible, coming from someone who has been starting my own business and doing all the things. I think it's impossible to be for everyone, and also just coming from someone who used to want to be for everyone and used to try to be for everyone. I think if you're for everyone, you're not for yourself. And that comes with knowing that some people aren't going to like you or understand you or want to be involved in what you're doing. And that can be really scary. And of course, my business is my own, so I don't have that responsibility to other people to show up in a certain way. But I've also just really turned to trusting my intuition to guide me to share what I need to share. And even if I know that some people aren't going to like it or understand it, I know that my intuition's telling me to share it for a reason, and the people who need to hear it or be impacted by it will be. And just trusting that. That's been my goal recently, because it's really hard to not have everyone understand you or want to support you.
No, I think I think you're right at baseline in any sense. It's very hard. That's very, 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 very hard. It just is. It's so weird that it's hard.
Yeah, I wish it wasn't so
But
hard.
but in a way, again, like social media is skewing it, and how are you using it, and what are you doing with it? Because I think it is a powerful tool. It's a way to communicate. There's no real limit to how many people you can reach.
Mm,
I think in both of our cases, it's not a matter of like let's reach a million people or now 10 million, or it's not about that at all. It's just like whether they're down the street or across the world, I would just want to be able to reach whoever might be down, with it.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy the things we get tied up in.
It is, and I have so much more to say, and I could truly talk to you all day, and I wish we had more time, but for the sake of your time, I know you're a father now. We will wrap up, and I want to ask you our last question, which is that living intuitively wild means living dedicated to your true, authentic self, no matter what. How do you feel like you live intuitively wild? Which is very related to what we were just talking about.
No, it totally is. I mean, I guess I mean, maybe I'm being a little harsh, but I'd say not at all.
That's not true.
Yeah, well, I mean, no, it's well, I guess I would say this, the way in which I learned to move the best I've been able to move in that way, intuitively wild, I established that like a long time ago. Like, when I first started teaching yoga and I stuck to it, I'm pleased with that.
Mm.
I absolutely stand behind everything I say and I do in those classes, and I have a lot of amazing connections that I've made, and so that absolutely, yes, for sure, definitely. I guess it's just more like you grow and you gain a lot of experience, and you perceive things differently than you used to, which I certainly do. And I just feel like I'm not really sure that I'm doing that now with the new perspective, tools, insights that I have after all these years teaching yoga. I'm not really sure I'm doing that anymore. I think I'm kind of like, well, I wouldn't want to lose this or that, which is a terrible way to live.
Well, one, I will say that you definitely live intuitively wild, but what it's sounding like to me is that you're just ready to embody this new evolution of who you are. And one thing I want to say really quick is that you're a 3-5 manifesting generator in human design with an open identity center. And what I'll say about that for now is all of that just speaks to evolving and transforming and growing and trying things and experimenting through life and letting yourself evolve and grow. So that's my message to you to end this off.
When am I going to hear about all that stuff? I don't know anything about any of that.
Anytime. I would love to tell you all about your
I
chart.
want to know the things. Yeah,
Yeah.
tell me. I want to know about.
Okay, well, we'll have to schedule time for me to tell you all about your chart. We
I'll
actually
pay you.
have a lot in common in certain parts of our chart, like certain gates, which are kind of like gifts, or when we have more
Mhm.
time, I'll go in detail, but we have certain similarities which are really interesting to me. So I'll have to
I'm
share all
sure.
of
I'm
that.
not surprised at all about that.
Yeah,
Okay.
I wasn't surprised about it either. Okay,
Okay.
well, please share with everyone where they can find you, connect with you, anything you want to share to end off.
Oh, if you're in the city, you should come to Sonic Yoga. I manage the studio and I teach there. And I would
Best
love to see you
classes.
there because there's nothing better than being face to face in the same room together. And with all that I've said, I think when the door closes, it's really what I want it to be.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope you'll join me there, Sonic Yoga in New York City, and otherwise at the Keith Partington. If I ever want to say anything or put anything out there, it'll be there at the Keith Partington on Instagram. So that's it.
Yes, and I will say that Keith's classes are truly my favorite classes that I've been ever taken, and I have taken classes all around the world with many different teachers, and Keith's still my favorite. So, highly recommend his classes. Keith, thank you so much for being here. It means a lot to me.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. Likewise. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Intuitively Wild, the podcast. I hope it helped deepen your connection to yourself, sparked some insights, and inspired you to live intuitively wild. If you enjoyed this podcast, it would mean so much to me if you would share it with others and leave a rating and review. And please reach out to me. I would love to connect with you. I will see you next time for more magic.